from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And at this time, I'd like to hand it over to Sandra Espada, who is the facilitator for the Puerto Rico Research Alliance for Dropout Prevention. Sandra, good morning.
Hi, good morning, Peter, and to all the participants that are already with us. It's good to see, all friends coming into this event, and as well as names of people that are not from Puerto Rico, which is really exciting. We were really happy to see the registration as it comes. We are expecting to have quite a few numbers of persons from Massachusetts and from New York, and so it's good because we at the Alliance wants always to have good conversations and share experiences from other jurisdictions. So good morning, and thanks for being with us. We are about to start, and I am, as Peter was saying, going to give you a little introduction of what the Puerto Rico Research Alliance for Dropout Prevention is about, and a brief overview of the agenda that we have ahead for today. This is a 2-hour webinar, and it's plenty of good information. And we want you to participate also, so please use the chat room and use the little person on the top bar if you want to talk over the phone instead of writing. I entered a little late because I was on the presenters chat room, but I assume that Peter Orn told you that this session will be recorded, so we want to capture all your good comments and suggestions about how to work on the topic of dropout prevention. So just use this technology to do that. And also remember to mute your phone if you are not going to be talking, because that could allow us to have a better audio of the webinar. The webinar, as I said, will have a presentation of the goals of the Research Alliance in Puerto Rico. Then Dr. Cummings will do an overview of the early warning systems research and the indicators that have been validated nationally and how we see those could be useful for the work that we're doing in the Puerto Rico Alliance, but I am sure those will be as well of interest to others working in other jurisdictions with your own projects. Jenny Scala will then walk you through the 7 steps implementation system that the National High School Center recommends when you are working in a design and in establishing an early warning system. And she will also do a demonstration of the National High School Center tool using some sample reports that that tool provides. And we expect you to ask as many questions as you want, and we have here at the end a discussion session, but feel free to go through the chat or through the telephone line, and throughout the presentation you will see that we have included segments where we can have conversations in between, so feel free to interrupt us whenever you want. At the end, we do need you to give us your feedback. We always appreciate that and use your comments and suggestions to enhance the work we do. And it's also a requirement of our funder, the Institute of Education Sciences. So we need you to stay at the end for a little longer, a couple of minutes, and do an online survey that we will use to collect your assessment of this event. So at this moment, I think it's appropriate to learn where you are from, and there is a poll here that you can go and check the jurisdiction where you come from, and we will wait a little bit to see the results. Also, check on your role. Use the bullet here that better describe your role in the organization that you are affiliated. I assume that you could be affiliated to a lot of these, so check the one that describe the majority of your time, of the time that you work. And it seems that we have a good representation of different segments of our community here in Puerto Rico and in other jurisdictions. So we have SEA staff, and we have nonprofit staff, as well as researchers and school personnel. So I'm glad to have a mix of perspectives, which is what we are also trying to achieve in the conversations of this topic. So good to know. The REL is a federally funded program, and it's organized in regions. We serve the Northeast and Islands region, which includes Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. That's the islands part of our region, and the northeastern states, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. I hope I'm not missing anyone. This is a program that wants to use time and resources to work on research and data to inform policy and practices throughout the education communities in the regions. So this round of the RELs, the Institute of Education Sciences has asked us to work in particularly organized through alliances in particular topics. The topic that we selected for Puerto Rico is dropout prevention, but we at REL-NEI also have 7 more alliances. You can see them in this slide: early childhood education, college and career readiness, educators' effectiveness, rural districts issues, English language learners, urban schools improvement issues, and college and career readiness from a more local perspective. The Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands alliances are local alliances. The main partners are stakeholders from the islands. The rest of the alliances serve multiple jurisdictions, so their focus is more regional. All information about these alliances, it's available in the REL-NEI website, and you can find there their structure and their scope of work and the research that they are establishing for the next years. The Puerto Rico Research Alliance main goal is to collaborate in preventing and reducing the number of students dropping out of school. We are in particular focused in assisting local stakeholders in developing an early warning system, and that's why we are doing this webinar today. This is like an introductory session for us to learn more about some models that have been used in developing early warning systems, but there's a lot of other sort of issues around that we want to address through our work. The team that REL-NEI has assigned to support this alliance it's me as the facilitator with Claire Morgan and Dr. O'Cummins as researchers for the Alliance. But we have at our access to an array of good experts from the organizations that are partners to the lab that can assist us. And the same occurs with the other alliances that I just mentioned. There's a lot of expertise and persons that they don't necessarily show in the front of the alliances, but are doing supporting work. So this is a pretty strong organization trying to support the work of the of education communities. This first year of the Alliance, which has been a planning year, we established what we are calling the core planning groups. And we were fortunate to have an excellent group of professionals from organizations in Puerto Rico that were interested in participating, and they are in fact collaborating with us. As you see here, the Department of Education, the Institute of Statistics, which some of them are participating in this webinar. So good morning to you and thanks for being here. The College Board, Puerto Rico and Latin American Office, it's also represented. And we have the two additional members that are in their professional lives affiliated to nonprofit organizations and to the University of Puerto Rico, but they also serve as members of the governing board of the regional educational lab in the Northeast and Islands region. They are Dr. Angeles Molina and Dr. Nelson Colon. So this is an interesting group, and I am really happy and fortunate to have them working with us. This group has assisted us in developing an agenda, a research agenda framework to guide the work of the Puerto Rico Alliance. And as you can see in this slide, we have identified three specific goals and the activities attached to that. We will start in assisting Puerto Rico to identify the longitudinal data that is needed to validate indicators for the early warning system, and that will be, I think, the majority of the work that we will start next year. And the second goal will be to develop the early warning system. The REL won't necessarily be the one developing it, but we are certainly committed to assist the governmental organizations in Puerto Rico that has the duty to do that, to establish the system. And we want to provide all the technical support that we can to be able to assist them. And then we want also to participate in the utilization of the early warning system, and the core planning group and the meetings that we have had have already identified many areas that need attention, and we hope to be able to support in those areas as well. So I'm stopping here because I don't want to use a lot of time in this introduction. Feel free to send me your comments or questions about. If you don't want to make them now, I am at the end of the presentation, our emails will show. But if you have questions now, we will be happy to answer them. So reading here in the participants chat. Wendy asked, what is the SEA? It's the State Educational Agency. Those are the departments of education throughout the jurisdiction. The federal legislation names them SEAs. I'm sorry, we use these letter soups. I'm glad you asked. Hi, Nelly Rivera O'Reilly. She's a senator from the Virgin Islands, so welcome. She asked if REL-NEI is also committed to support the government to develop a dropout plan. Yes, as I mentioned, one of the alliances that we are working with is the College and Career Readiness Alliance in the Virgin Islands, and we have been working. We also have a core planning group established, and we have been working with stakeholders to provide support and having conversations with the districts and the state agency to address issues that relates to dropout prevention. So yes is the answer, and I'm glad you asked. Yes, Jan has made a good comment related to the first question of what is an SEA. Here in Puerto Rico, the federal Department of Education considers that the Department of Education, the local one, is a single district. So we really don't categorize regions or districts in Puerto Rico as LEAs for federally funded programs. I think that there is a municipal school system that is in the process of getting recognized as an LEA, and I'm referring to the San Juan Municipality School System. But at the state level, we almost always refer exclusively to the Puerto Rico Department of Education, and that on our jargon will be the SEA. I will send you information about the alliance. This is Tuneli Rivera who's asking about information, I assume, for the USBI Research Alliance. And yes, I will email you after this webinar information for you to have more information. Thanks again for asking. Pat Frost from Nebraska, welcome. This is working with multi-agency group regarding court-involved youth. There's a sex in school and transition back to public school. And we've seen a lot of ways in which the states and other non-governmental organizations work with youth and trying to get them back to school to complete their high school diploma and get them, en route to either to careers or to get into college. So I'm glad you're here, and we're looking forward for your suggestions and ways to address this. So keep your questions coming. I am going to introduce the presenters of today. Mindy O'Cummins is going to start first, and then Jenny Scala. Mindy has been working as the Puerto Rico Research Alliance researcher for this first year. And she is a senior research analyst at the American Research Institutes. There she devotes her time to conduct research and evaluation studies and to provide technical assistance in an array of topics. She has published a lot of reports and studies, and she also has participated as the early warning system team leader of the National High School Center. So there's expertise in her that she is willing and able to provide. And then I am going to also introduce Jenny, and they will take it over. Jenny is also a research analyst at the American Research Institute. Her work is in the side of technical assistance provided. She do evaluations of need assessment. She's engaged in projects such as the California Comprehensive Center, the evaluation of the Hawaii Race to the Top initiative, and she is also a specialist, of technical assistance specialist at the National Center on Response to Intervention. So I think we have two good experts, and and good friends of the Regional Educational Lab with us today. So let's hear from them about this, and talk to you a little bit later.
Great, Sandra. Thank you for that introduction. I think Jenny and I are both really excited to be here today and share with you some of the knowledge that we've developed through both our work with the REL and through our work together on the National High School Center at the American Institutes for Research. So we, again, the basis for a lot of this knowledge was developed out of the National High School Center, but that has been continued to be contributed to through a variety of projects, including the work that we've been able to do with the U.S. Virgin Islands through both this contract and a previous contract with the REL, and more recently work that we've been able to do with Puerto Rico. So we look forward to those and those continued works. Before I actually begin in talking about early warning systems, I'm really interested to see how familiar you are. So I'm going to do a quick poll, and if you could just let me know how familiar you are with the early warning system research, I would appreciate it. So not familiar to very familiar. This will help guide my presentation. It looks like we have some diversity today in the participants, but that we have definitely some probably desire to hear a little bit, so that would be great. I will take this time to talk a little bit about the research before we actually dive into talking about the implementation process and demonstrating a tool for you. So first, what is an early warning system? An early warning system is a mechanism or a tool that schools can be used and districts can also and states can benefit from the knowledge of to predict which students are at the greatest risk of dropping out of high school. And why do we want to do that? Not just to understand who they are, but really we want to make sure that we can take what those limited resources are at the school level and target them to those students that most need those services and help them to get back on track and enable them to persist through school. Also, if we look at this data in much more of an aggregate form, we can examine those school or district-wide patterns to identify climate issues throughout the school. So I think it's really important to really hone in on that early warning systems can be used at the student level, and then that data can be really targeted to the student level, but also can be used at a school level to look at trends and patterns in the data. And we'll be able to show you that through this presentation. A key to the early warning system tool is having reliable and valid indicators so we can identify those students that are most at risk for dropping out. And through a lot of research that has been done and began early on with the Consortium in Chicago School Research and Johns Hopkins University, but has been replicated in numerous places and by numerous researchers around the country, and including has been replicated in the U.S. Virgin Islands and in process of being replicated in Puerto Rico. So, and what are the indicators? The indicators have tended to fall around three kind of main areas: engagement, course performance, and behavior. And under those three main areas, you can see the types of indicators that have been primarily used. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the subsequent slides. It's important to know that this research, I think, can be very, because of the robustness and of the findings, can be easily generalized to a lot of locations, but local adaptation is key if able to be done. So let's take a moment and look at the research behind these indicators. And this is, again, done by the Consortium of Chicago School Research by Allensworth and Easton. The chart that you see right now on the screen breaks up students by the number of days that they were absent in a semester. So it's in a 90-day grading period. And on the far left side of the screen, you can see those students that were only absent 0 to 4 days during that semester. And those students have a greater than 80% likelihood or have graduated. What happens when that goes up 5 to 9 days? You can see their likelihood or the percentage of those students that graduated dropped drastically. And again, at 10 to 14 days, only 40% of those students went on to graduate. This trend continues to persist as the number of days absent gets larger, the likelihood or the percentage of students that graduated gets smaller and smaller. A lot of people have asked and are concerned about subgroups of students, and this chart looks at students with disabilities to see if the same patterns hold for those students. So as you can see on the far left, it's no identified disability. This chart breaks up the students again, those that have no identified disability by the same groups of 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, so on and so forth, days absent, and then again looks at their the percentage of those students that graduated. You can see that this chart looks very similar to the one in the previous slide, demonstrating the high correlation between attendance and graduation. In the previous slide, it included all students, irregardless of student characteristic. This now one on the far left is students that do not have an identified disability. Of those students that do not have identified disability but were 2 or greater years behind in reading or English language arts, you can see the same pattern persists. You'll see that there are some categories that aren't present just because there wasn't enough students in that category to present. And then we look at 3 areas of disability: learning disability, mild cognitive disability, and emotional disturbance. And again, we see very similar patterns in the data. So these data that can identify or can show the correlation between attendance and graduation not only hold true for all students, but for also subgroups of students. This chart here shows freshman course failures. So again, on the bottom of the chart, we see the number of days or the number of courses a student has failed. And then we see the percentage of those students that have gone on to graduate. Those students that haven't failed any courses, over 80% go on to graduate. But when a student just fails one course, you can see that that drops down to about 70%. And when it's 2 or more courses, it goes to below 60%. So you can see the very high correlation, again, with course failures and graduation. Interestingly, in this chart, it's not talking just about core courses. And we often think about the importance of core courses or gateway courses and graduation, algebra, English language arts. This actually is showing the relationship between any course failure and graduation. And I think that's a really important note, to know that failure of any subject, even be it PE or art, is highly predictive of a student's likelihood to go on and graduate. This chart again breaks it down by those subgroups that I've just identified before. And in here you can see that the patterns again hold very true. For not only is this pattern very apparent for all students, it's also apparent for those students that don't have an identified disability, that are 2 years or more behind, or that have an identified disability. In the next graph, I'm showing the relationship between freshman, GPA, and eventual graduation. This time I'd ask that you look on the far right-hand side of the graph, and you can see those students that have a 3.5 or greater GPA have a tremendous likelihood of graduating, nearly 100%. But what happens when that starts to drop? Let's look at going over to about the middle to 2.0. You can see that it's just over 70% for those students that have a 2.0 GPA go on to graduate. Again, this holds true not only for the whole population, but again for those subpopulations. So the researchers at Chicago didn't only develop these or look at these indicators that were valid at the end of each grading period, but they also looked at a cumulative or a combined indicator that was valid at the end of the ninth grade year, and they called it the on-track indicator. And for a student to be on track, they looked at course failures, and now we're not just looking at any course, but core courses and freshman credit accumulation. So a student that's on track has received enough credits to be promoted from the 9th to the 10th grade and has failed no or one core course. If either of these conditions aren't present, then the student would be considered off track. Why is this important? This on-track indicator is actually tells a lot of story. I think one of the stories it tells for me is kind of a story of hope. And that, so in this graph, what we're showing is the relationship of on-track and off-track indicators, but we've broken it up by students' academic achievement. So you can see that there's 4 pairs of bar charts. The one on the far left that says bottom, those are the students that were in the bottom quartile in academic achievement. So those are the students that came in that we perceive as having the least kind of academic skills to go on and persist. On the far right are those students that did the best, that really did well on the academic achievement tests that were given, and these were given in math and English language arts. The 2 middle, the second and third quartiles in the middle, are those students that did around the mean or median. So then for each of those quartiles, we looked at those students that were on and off track. So let's again look on the far left and look at those students that were in the bottom quartile for academic achievement, but then were on or off track for according to on and off track indicator. Those students that were in the bottom quartile but were on track, so didn't fail more than one core course and got enough credits to be promoted, 68% of those students went on to graduate versus 14% that were off track. The story behind that to me is a student even that is struggling academically may not have all of the prerequisite skills, given enough support in high school to pass their courses and get credit, have a high likelihood of going on to graduate. So we can do it. We can still provide, even at the high school level, these students with ample support, the skills that they need to persist through high school and go on to graduate. The flip side, if you look at the far right-hand side, is those students in the top. These are students that have a lot of academic skills, or we perceive that through their academic testing. But those students that are, and many of these students go on to graduate, especially those that are on track. But if those students are off track for whatever reason, be it the content isn't engaging, they have conflicting obligations in their life, or they don't perceive school as relevant, those students often do not graduate. So if they're off track, they still have a high likelihood of not graduating, 37% of them. So as a reminder, what is on and off track? On track is that they've failed, or on track is that they failed one or less core courses and have enough credits to go on and graduate. Off track is that they don't have enough credits or they failed 2 or more courses. These patterns that I just showed you for students really hold true again for those different subgroups of students, those without disabilities, those that are 2 years behind and have identified learning disabilities. So the evidence that I showed you was some seminal research on those early warning indicators for high school. And it really, the research began looking really at 9th grade and the predictiveness of 9th grade, and that was the Ellsworth and Easton research. A lot of research has been done subsequently that's continued to validate that research even further into the high school continuum, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Also, Johns Hopkins research and others have looked at earlier indicators to see if we can even predict students younger and younger. And in one study by Bob Balfons in 2009, he showed that 6th grade students demonstrating at least one flag had only a 10 to 20% likelihood of graduating from high school in 5 years. So these are 6th grade students that had either a attendance rate of 80% or lower, they failed math or English, or they had an unsatisfactory behavior grade. If a student had any one of those flags, their likelihood of graduating was tremendously decreased. So you can see that these same types of indicators that we found to be very useful in high school can be very useful earlier on in middle school. So in summary, the National High School Center has identified what we like to kind of think of as commonly accepted indicators, both at the middle grades and the high school level. And these are summarized for you in this chart. And in the later presentation that Jenny's going to show you, she'll show you a tool that actually can enable a school, given these indicators, to apply them to their own setting and identify those students that are at risk. I'm interested to know now if any of you are currently using an early warning system tool. I saw a lot of you from Massachusetts, and I know there's a lot of work going on there with early warning systems. So it looks like a few of you are potentially using an early warning system tool, but the majority of you are not at this point in time. Before I turn it over to Jenny to talk about an early warning intervention and monitoring system process and demonstrate an early warning system tool, there appears to be a few questions. So I'm going to take a moment to just answer those. The first one was in regards to getting a little lost in the off-track and on-track discussion. So I apologize for that. So I went over again kind of the indicators, what is an on and off track indicator, and let me just go through this chart quickly again and see if I can't be a little bit more clear about this. So on the bottom of the chart, we took students and we broke them into 4 categories based on their academic achievement. So those that so at the bottom scale on the far left were those students that did the poorest in their academic achievement testing. On the far right, the top are those students that did the best. And the 2 middle quartiles, the second and third, you can see in there. And then once we broke those students down into these 4 groups based on academic achievement, we looked at how they did on the on and off track indicator. And so on the far left, the bottom, students that were in the bottom quartile, those students, if they were on track, they were very likely to go on and graduate. So despite not maybe having those academic skills, if they were given the support that they needed to persist and get those freshman credits and pass those core courses, the majority, 68% of those students went on to graduate high school. On the far right, those students that came in with a lot of academic skills, they are our highest scoring students on academic achievement tests in the top. Those students also that were on track, that had enough credits and were passing their core courses, 90% of them went on to graduate. But we have the likelihood, if we don't give those students that rigorous and relevant content, to lose them as well. And 37% of those students that were not able to get enough credits or failed 2 or more core courses didn't go on to graduate. I hope that provides you a little bit more context in regards to the on and off track indicator. Also, there was a question about ELL, and the same analysis that, so the National High School Center was really interested in just the question that you had, kind of. So there was a lot of research out there about early warning indicators, but nobody had broken it up by these subgroups. And so the National High School Center contracted with the Consortium and Chicago School Research to actually go back and revalidate their indicators for subgroups. The first analysis that they did were for students with disabilities, and that were the findings that I presented here today. The second report that they did were for students that were English language learners, and we found very similar findings that these same types of indicators were just as valid to identify those students that did not have English as their first language. I think that that's really an important question, and to think about how that applies to different contexts. And if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I really emphasized the importance of exploring this, these issues in your own local context. And we're excited to be able to watch the Institutes of Education Science in collaboration with the Puerto Rico Department of Education do this type of validation work. Are there any other questions before I turn it over to Jenny? I see a few people maybe typing, so I'll just give it one more moment here. So Jan had asked, do you think that the language proficiency in Puerto Rico will be Spanish and not ELA? I think that the data will easily be able to tell us, and and I don't want to speak on behalf of the Institutes of Education Sciences, but in early conversations with those that are doing the analysis there, they definitely are looking at language proficiency in their model. So I think that we'll have a lot more information as that comes out, but I would be, I wouldn't want to speculate too much, but in current studies, we show that these same types of indicators are working across most subgroups of students. There's also a question about low income and family trends, and I think that's a really important issue in student characteristics. What this research has found is that this actionable data, attendance, course performance, and even behavior grades, tends to be more predictive than student characteristics. And I think that's really kind of a nice finding because it levels the playing ground. It enables us to identify those students that are risk of dropping out despite what their characteristics are, their language, their socioeconomic status, or their race or ethnicity, giving everyone an equal opportunity to be identified. Now, that being said, we definitely see that more students that are from low-income families, from different race and ethnicity subgroups, and those students with disabilities, especially those students with disabilities that have behavior-related goals in their IEP, tend to be identified at a much greater rate using these types of indicators. Another question came in about gender trends. We identify using indicators slightly more boys in many studies than girls, although in a few recent studies I've actually seen that flip. And although that be the case, it doesn't tend to be a significant difference, and both of them tend to reflect the ultimate graduation and dropout rate in the district. So they seem to work really well. Family circumstances trends. Regretfully, many of these studies, because they're reliant upon readily available data. And I think that's a strength of the early warning system tool, is that it is reliant on this readily available data that the school has at their hands, and it's actually very valid and works very well to identify students with that are at risk of dropping out. So it doesn't get into those family circumstances and kind of, and another question was scholarly level of parents or parents' education level. But now, all that being said, when Jenny presents in a little while, we talk about how we can integrate that kind of information into not identifying the students that are most at risk of dropping out, but instead, as we move from those indicators to that intervention, we really need to go in depth and learn about kind of what's going on, and all that type of information really informs that process. So I'm sure that Jenny's going to be able to give us a lot of rich information on how that information can be used within the process. So although it's not used as part of the indicator analysis or indicators of identifying those students, it is used to inform how we go about and actually inform our interventions. It looks like one more person's typing, and then after this, it was just a thanks. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jenny Scala, to talk to you a little bit about the early warning intervention and monitoring system, and then demonstrate an early warning system tool that the National High School Center has developed to serve as a model for others that would like to either use the tool and or to use it as a model in developing their own tool.
Great. Thank you, Mindy. Good morning, everyone. This is Jenny Scala. And Mindy gave a nice overview in terms of what I will be discussing today. And just a brief background that a lot of this information, and Mindy alluded to this earlier, much of our work has actually stemmed and grown out of work that was done from the National High School Center, which is the NHSC here on the slide. Just wanted to give you that context of that's where this has come from in terms of providing some of the foundational aspect, but then we've expanded and built on that work in many different contexts. And one of those aspects was really thinking about this early warning intervention and monitoring system implementation process. Because Mindy provided us the background and the research on those thresholds and when students are going to be identified for being at risk of not graduating or of dropping out. And really then we have to then do work around, okay, we've identified students and we're not done. And in fact, in some ways, a lot of our work is just beginning at that point in time. And I know that people cannot hear me well. This is the best that my phone can get, and I apologize about that. But this is the strongest and loudest, and I am on top of the microphone. So I apologize on that. Let me see if this is slightly better. Let me try. Is this any better? If I talk a little bit, does that sound great? Okay. So it sounds like some people can hear me slightly better now. Great. So in terms of this 7-step implementation process, really the beginning steps are establishing roles, talking about establishing a team, who's going to be responsible, shared ownership for a lot of this work. It needs to be shared across people. Then we're going to talk about using a tool, and we're going to I will highlight and give an overview demonstration of the National High School Center tool towards the end of today's session. And we have some additional steps on focusing on once we're using the tool, what do we need to pay attention to and address as we're looking at our data that's in the tool? How are we interpreting the data? And that's really, from the beginning of establishing your team all the way down to interpreting the data, that's steps 1 through 4 in this implementation process. Step 5 is focusing on providing those interventions. So Mindy talked a little bit about, so what are some of these family characteristics? How do we look at some of our trends? What are our trends telling us? And we're going to do that in the middle between step 4 and step 5 in order to be able to make sure that we're assigning and providing appropriate interventions for students. And then step 6 addresses monitoring students. And step 7 is this evaluation and refinement. We know that this is an ongoing process, and we want to make sure that we were explicit in having a step that really addressed this refinement and this evaluation aspect. So this next section of the presentation, I'm going to walk through each of these steps and talk about various components within the steps that are important and things to pay attention to as you're in these steps and as you walk through these steps. So the first one is establishing your roles and your responsibilities. So there is a lot of work that can be shared among a team in order to really be able to looking at your early warning system data, using the tool, and then making these intervention selections, providing, monitoring. You want to have a team. It would be really cumbersome if just one person were the person responsible for all of this work. So some key memberships that you might want to include in your team are listed on this slide. So first of all, we want to make sure that there's someone who has the authority to make decisions so that we can say, all right, we know that we need to change directions or we know that we need to do X, Y, or Z, whatever that may be, but that we have someone that can say, we're going to do that and move that work forward. We also want to make sure that we have participants on this early warning system team that have the knowledge of the students, particularly diverse students that are in the school. It could be that means that you rotate in members to the team as necessary when you're talking about different or discussing different students or groups of students. That's okay, but you want to make sure that there's this diverse representation on the team. You also want to make sure that there's someone who has the expertise in analyzing data and managing data that's in the tool. And those could be two different people, that could be multiple people, but you want to make sure that you do have someone with that knowledge in terms of that the analysis of the data. And in terms of the managing the data, another person to think about would be including a technology person. This data, as Mindy said, is readily available. It's often in student information systems or in other Excel spreadsheets in the school, so you want someone that can help collect and gather the data and be able to help run some of these reports that are in the tool and just monitoring the data input and process. In thinking of your early warning system teams, you want to make sure that these teams are meeting regularly. And the frequency in which that happens is going to be dependent on how a school really customizes this process. There could be another team that takes on some of these early warning system responsibilities. It doesn't have to be a new team established within the school. It could be that there's another team that's doing some of this, and so they could augment some of their roles and responsibilities to include aspects of early warning systems. So the meeting regularly, that's to be determined by you. You want it to be frequent enough, but you don't want it to be overwhelming and too much so that work isn't being able to be completed within the school. You also want to make sure that you're figuring out how you're going to communicate some of the dropout prevention or early warning system risk status issues to groups and individuals outside the team. And this includes just sharing information in general so that staff in the school are familiar with what these early warning system indicators are, so that there's that familiarity and that knowledge, as well as in how are you communicating out decisions. And if decisions are made, how does that information get shared? You also want to make sure if you're sharing that information that there is an opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback. So thinking of what those mechanisms might be, how is that going to be done, and how is that going to be done in a way that most people can contribute. And then you also want to figure out how and what the process is going to look like for monitoring students' progress. And there is step 6 that's just focused on this monitoring students' progress, but oftentimes you're going to want to figure out what the connections are between staff who are delivering those interventions, where that data might be stored for progress monitoring, and how that data gets brought to this early warning system team. So in thinking of just this general description of an early warning system team, we do have a poll that we're going to pause here and have you answer. And as we move this forward, it's wondering if there's an existing team in your school or your district that's similar to this early warning intervention and monitoring system, the roles and responsibilities that I just described. I'll give it a few more seconds, but it seems like there's a few people that might be unsure, but it sounds like there might not be an existing team that's already doing some of this work within your school. So it might be of interest to think about who could be and how to help organize an early warning intervention and monitoring system. Great. All right, we're going to keep moving forward with the slides. And we will, I know that there have been some questions that are being in the chat box. We do have more time later on where we'll answer those, and I believe Mindy might be answering some of those along the way as well, but know that we will get to those questions in a little bit. So step 2 is we're going to then be using the early warning system tool, early warning system tools. So there's some important considerations as you're using the tool. First of all, you want to make sure that this data is being entered regularly, making sure that there's a procedure for that there is somebody responsible for it, which gets and ties very closely to the next bullet of having at least one individual as the responsible person for loading the data into the tool. And this is a situation in the tool, it's one of those where you really are going to need to make some decisions of what makes the most sense given your staff, given your local context. And one of those decisions is going to be on who will be responsible for loading the data. It generally, in working with other schools and districts, has been at least one person, but oftentimes it's two people that might be rotating through it. Again, it just really depends of what your team member construct is. You want to make sure that your team, your early warning system teams, are trained so that they understand the use of the indicators within the tool. And you'll see the tool later on, as I said, but we really want to make sure that people have this depth of understanding of what the tool is signifying and what the information that we're getting from the tool is, so that people can really use this data to inform their work and have good conversations when the team is meeting. We want to make sure that there are reports, and I will be highlighting about 12 reports today. We want to make sure that those reports are being used, but that also means that they need to be accessible to the team members so that they can make decisions. And it also means that you might need additional data from other sources that aren't included in data that are not only from the early warning system tool. So you might need to bring in additional data. And so thinking of how those considerations are going to be done, how do you again communicate that information out to other staff who have access to that data so that you can have those connections. Again, the student progress monitoring aspect. We continue to bring this up throughout our steps because we know that it's really critically important because we want to make sure that we have data that determines and tells us if students are making progress as they're getting and receiving additional supports. Because if they're not, then we want to think about making some adjustments. So in order to do that, we need additional data throughout this process. And there are a series of conversations related to student progress, how you're going to do that. And again, we'll talk more about that in step 6. Step 3 is where we're taking the time. We've put data into the tool. That was step 2. Now step 3, we're going to review our data. And we're going to look at this data. We're going to monitor it as we input data throughout the school year. And that generally happens during there's an initial time period where we're going to put in the attendance. Mindy was talking about attendance indicators earlier. So we have a tool, we have information within the tool where you can input attendance for a 20 or 30-day count. You can input that data. Then additional data is going to be inputted at your grading periods. So then once we put in our information, we want to make sure that we're then reviewing this data and that we're monitoring these indicators. And as we do this, this allows us, and the tool helps us, identify students who are at risk for dropping out. So we can look at individual students, and then we want to make sure that people not only look at individual students, but then looking at our groups of students so that we can look at patterns. And these patterns can be focused on student engagement and academic performance. These groups and these trends, these patterns that we look at, we want to really pay attention to those so that we can make sure that we're providing appropriate supports at all levels for all types of students. And there are some questions that are on the slide that you can ask when you're looking at your data. So specific to student level patterns. So looking at individual students, what is our data telling us of these individual students who are at risk? Are there any surprises? As we've given this training and as I've worked with multiple schools across the country, oftentimes people will look at their student level patterns and say, that's really maybe not surprising, or perhaps this is surprising on certain areas. And then if they look at some of these patterns, that's where they start to find some interesting kind of moments, as I call them, or aha moments they find something that's interesting where they want to delve deeper and to look more at their data to see how their data can help them inform their decisions as they move forward. We really do want people to look beyond just those individual students and look at some of those patterns so they can really inform the support as they move forward. Which gets us very quickly into the fourth step of interpreting our data. So these indicators are observable symptoms. They are not root causes. So the tool is identifying who's at risk, not at risk. It's not going to tell us why a student is at risk or what the implications are for really changing things. That's what we have to do when we're really looking at our root causes. Again, additional data might be necessary and might be really helpful beyond these indicators to really determine our root causes. The data in the tool is going to tell us if a student's at risk or not. It's not going to tell us that perhaps someone's really struggling at home for whatever reasons in terms of attendance is really driving that. So we do need additional information when we're really looking at these root causes. And looking beyond these indicators, it can help us identify these common needs across groups of students. And I know that we stress this throughout the information and throughout the presentation today, but it's one of these aspects that it's really important to look beyond just individual students. It's important to look at individual students to make sure that they're getting the appropriate interventions and the selections and supports that they need, but we do want to make sure that we step back and look at trends. And if we look, and as we look at those trends, that's when we'll be able to identify supports that might be necessary for a broader group of students. So it's really important to make sure that we look at individuals, but also groups and common needs across groups of students. As we're looking at our data, it's very likely that looking at the data is going to raise new and additional questions. And so keeping track of these questions, the team needs to figure out and have some sort of process in place so that they can track these questions. And it might be that they need to go get additional data that's not at their fingertips when they start to have these conversations. So then how do they then follow up and make sure that there's a plan for following up to make sure that they get answers to those questions so that they're ultimately understanding why students are falling off track and making sure that they can provide additional supports. And as common for many things, this additional data, thinking about triangulating data, we know within education that the more that we can triangulate our data and examine additional data can really help us make decisions as we're making decisions. So this fifth step is assigning and providing interventions. And we know that step 5 can take a long time. There are many sub-steps within step 5. But we wanted to make sure that people were aware that, okay, so we've used the tool, we've identified what students are at risk, we want to then provide supports. So we want to make sure that people are aware of the importance of assigning and providing interventions and making sure that there's matches between student needs, the priorities, and what the data is telling us. And that's why making sure that you get to those root causes and determining those root causes in step 4 can become particularly helpful as you move forward, because if you're really not sure what that root cause is, you might be hindered in selecting and providing an appropriate intervention that's really matching a student's need. So making sure that we've gotten to those root causes, we want to also make sure that there are looking across the school, knowing what existing academic and behavioral supports that are either in the school, the district, or the community that can be used to help students when we're thinking about assigning and providing interventions. There's plenty of time that will be spent on this step. It is a single step. We have a few more slides that talk about this step, but we do want to be fair and acknowledge that this step is a long, can be long, and many sub-steps within this step. Within the tool that the National High School Center has created that I will show you in a few minutes, we do have the capability of, or you have the capability of identifying and cataloging 30 unique interventions in the intervention setting page, which I'll show you, which means that as you're trying to find out what interventions are being used already across the school, because it's very likely that within your high school or your middle school that you might be working with, that there are already different strategies, supports, programs that are in place that might be used or could be additionally provided to more students to really support students who are identified as being at risk. The tool allows you to catalog these interventions based off of if they're an academic, behavior, or attendance intervention, so linking right directly back to what the research-based indicators are, and then also by tier. And with tiers, I mean we've organized the tool so that you can identify and incorporate a tiered approach for prevention. So many people are familiar with this triangle. It comes from response to instruction, response to intervention, multi-tiered system of support, positive behavior instructional support uses the same tier as well, or triangle as well. And it's really what this triangle is addressing is saying, all right, we have all of our students. We want to make sure that the majority of our students are served. Well, all of our students are receiving really strong or tier 1 instruction. And if you're using in a tiered approach, approximately 80% of your students should be sufficiently served with a really strong tier 1 support. And this, you'll see that the triangle is broken up on the left with an academic focus and on the right a behavior focus. It's the same idea of a tiered approach if you're focusing on academics or behavior. The content and the focus of it changes, but how it plays out in terms of what those critical components are and the breakdowns of approximate percentages of students getting served at different levels remains the same. So about 80% of your students should be sufficiently served with this strong Tier 1 support. About 15% of your students are going to need what's called Tier 2 or supplemental targeted supports. These are generally finite, so they're time-bound. And again, it's really targeted supplemental, and it's about for about 15% of your students. An additional 5% of your students are going to need this Tier 3 or individual customized supports. And that's for students who have intensive needs. You'll see within this triangle that we have this blue triangle that cuts through all 3 levels, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And that's where students who are English language learners or students with disabilities, that's what that smaller triangle represents, because those students are going to be served at any or all level based on their needs. So this is not to say that Tier 3 is just for students who are receiving special education services or who are for English language learners. Again, it's that students are served at all levels based on their needs. And this is a really quick overview to a tiered approach, but I do want to see, we have one final poll asking how many of you are currently using a tiered system of support, whether it's response to intervention, PBIS, or a multi-tiered system of support in your school or district. It looks like most of you are unsure. I'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. We have a few more people that are responding saying that they are using a tiered system of support, and a few aren't. But it looks like most of you are unsure. Okay, great. Let's go back to the slides. And the reason that I asked this question is because if you're using this this tiered approach, if you think about some of those groups of students we were talking about, really looking at not just individual students, but trends across groups of students, you could find that it's really important based on your data to strengthen what's happening at your Tier 1 level of instruction and support for all students, and strengthening that really might help, and that might be some aspect that your data is indicating would be very useful for your students at your school. So there's this tiered approach, which also can help you look at your resources and allocate appropriately. And then we often get asked this question of, okay, I understand this tiered support. We've identified what students are at risk. We understand what some of our groups and our needs are based off of our data. What's next? So, how do we go about selecting and choosing different strategies, programs, supports? And one of those aspects, we do have a slide with some examples of research-based interventions specific for dropout prevention programs. We do encourage people to make sure that they're looking at what the research base is on different interventions and programs as they're contemplating selecting different and using different programs. This slide is just examples. You'll see that the first three work are for middle grades, as well as some of those are also for high school students as well. You can find more information on the research base behind these programs, as well as additional programs on the What Works Clearinghouse website, Doing What Works. The National High School Center also has some information that they've done looking at some of the research-based strategies in dropout prevention programs, and then mapping those to different programs, common programs, to see where those strategies are. Oftentimes, schools and districts are interested in really implementing strategies, research-based strategies, maybe not an entire program, so that might be a useful resource as well. And then there's also a few other resources that can help you identify some of the research base on the various dropout prevention programs, including the National Dropout Prevention Center Network. They do have a database on different programs. And if you're interested in learning more on social-emotional learning, I know that the Collaborative of Academic Social-Emotional Learning, or CASEL, also is in the process of updating their 2003 publication on social-emotional learning programs and the research base behind those. They actually just updated and released a version for preschool and elementary school, and by next summer they will have an updated version of the secondary school social-emotional programs as well. So there are some places where you can get more information on the research base for different dropout prevention programs. The sixth step is this monitoring. We know that we need to monitor students. So we can and use our monitoring data, and for students who are participating in these additional supports, monitoring these students allows us to really look at the students who have been identified and say, okay, are their needs still not being met, or are they no longer struggling? So this monitoring, this progress monitoring data allows us to look at, okay, we know what students are identified as being at risk. We're providing supports. Now we're going to monitor how students are doing, because maybe this additional support means that they're no longer at risk. And the monitoring data also helps us determine if the new interventions or the current interventions are meeting students' needs, as well as if they're meeting students' needs at an acceptable rate of improvement. We want to make sure that students are improving, but that they're improving at a rate that means that they're going to meet their long-term goals. So it's not just whether or not they're making progress, but it's also what's the rate of progress and improvement. Additionally, we use this data to monitor the effectiveness of the interventions. We do want to make sure that those interventions are effective, and one of the ways that we can do that is looking at the progress monitoring data. And then we also need to make sure that we're communicating. Again, we want to make sure that we're communicating with these appropriate stakeholders, solicit their involvement. If we're making changes in an intervention, we want to make sure that we're communicating with those stakeholders, particularly those people who are providing the interventions. We want to make sure that those interventions are being delivered as they were designed and intended to be delivered. And once we do that through communication and having discussions, maybe we're doing some monitoring as well for observations. But there's a lot of information that we need to be able to continue to get for progress monitoring. And some of this information you can collect and gather within the Early Warning System tool, but you might also need to get additional data from other points and other places to really help make sure that you're monitoring students frequently enough to make appropriate decisions. And then the seventh step is looking at this continuous evaluation and refinement process. So we want to make sure that we refine the implementation process during the school year as we're going, if we're learning, if the team is deciding that, you know what, that protocol that we were using or that agenda for our team meetings wasn't quite right. We want to make sure that we continue to refine that throughout the year as needed, as we're approaching and determining what those areas are where we need refinement, that we continue to do that. We also want to make sure that at the end of the school year that there is some discussion and debriefing in terms of what worked really well with the team and the tool, how did that information get disseminated out to staff, how did students do, were we monitoring students along the way, so that we have this debrief at the end of the year so that we can also set some plans for when we start up in the fall and for the next school year. So again, taking the time at the end of the school year to do that is strongly encouraged. We also know that this evaluation and refinement process does allow us to look at short and long-term needs and solutions, not only for student needs, but also more global aspects in terms of school climate. And also this process of having this refinement and evaluation aspect can also help us determine if there are holistically some organizational needs, whether those be at the school, district, or the state, and being able to have the data that we're using in these conversations within the early warning system team and others at the school and district to really determine what those are and what those might look like. So I'm going to pause here for questions just on the 7-step process to see if there are any before I get into the demonstration. And it looks like Peter provided the What Works Clearinghouse website link, which is great. It looks like there have been some long comments as well. So if there are any questions that haven't been answered up to this point in time, just on the 7-step, why don't you put those into the participant chat window again? And Pat, yes, this webinar will remain posted as an archive so that you can look at that later on as you need to. And Peter just put the link for the IES practice guide. And for those of you that are not typing right now, if you haven't downloaded the documents from today, you might want to do that, particularly the Word document, the EWS reports. As I walk through the tool in a few minutes, you will probably want that document open. It gives a summary of the available tools, or excuse me, the available reports and the purpose of those reports. So April just commented that she had challenge trouble opening up the Word document. Did other people have any challenges opening up the Word document? Tara raised a really important comment that this in terms of the evaluation and refinement seems like it could be a process in and of itself, and that's absolutely the case. And I think that a lot of that refinement is going to happen within each of those other steps. I don't think that some of that refinement is really held off, so to speak, until step 7. I think a lot of that ends up being embedded throughout the other steps. And the next question that she asked was if most of those evidence-based strategies programs need to be purchased. That depends on the different program, and really one of the aspects in terms of selecting appropriate interventions that I would really encourage people to get clarity on is really what your needs and your priorities are, and make sure that those are an appropriate match between your needs and your priorities. Some schools that I've worked with have not had the resources to purchase kind of packaged or published different programs. So what they are doing is that they have looked at the various resources that Peter mentioned with the Dropout Prevention IES Practice Guide. Jan Flieger also shared the Doing What Works website. And they've looked at the research of the strategies. And so rather than implementing a specific program, they have identified what strategies, research-based strategies they're implementing based off of their student needs and priorities. And then those schools have also determined how they're going to monitor student progress since they are just embedding those strategies. They've identified how they're going to monitor progress, student progress along the way. And there was a question on RFPs for implementing early warning system work. I am less familiar with that. I think that also depends on your location and your level in terms of if you're at a district or a school. And I do know often that some schools and districts are combining their early warning system efforts with some other efforts that might be going on in the school and really leveraging resources in that capacity. And there was a question that Nellie asked about policymakers and how they can promote intervention strategies for example, as state examples. That's a great question. Oftentimes, well, sometimes states are going through and looking at the research of different programs, and they are putting forth a list of research-based programs so that they can, states generally are not able to make any kind of recommendations or endorsements for different programs. They can often put up a list of what different programs or strategies that do have the research base associated with them at the level and caliber that the state wants. So they often will put out a state list of not approved and not endorsed, but possible programs, and explaining that they've gone through the process of really looking at the research base and providing kind of this summary of what that research base might be to staff in districts and schools, just to help narrow down the selection process. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into providing the demonstration of the early warning system tool. And if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I will load that up. So you will be able to see my screen now. There is a button on your Adobe platform, Adobe Connect platform, where you can view this as a full screen. You can hit that button if you want to view it as a full screen. Just know if you do that, you will not be able to see some of the chat. You won't be able to see that as we go through this, but then once we go back to the slides, you will be able to see that. So a few kind of opening remarks on the early warning system tool from the National High School Center. This is an Excel-based tool, which is great because most people have Excel. You will need to enable macros. When you first open up the tool, this bar right here, you'll have a little warning that says, do you want to enable macros? And you do want to enable macros because this tool works entirely off of having those macros. And once you've enabled your macros, this is the first thing that pops up. So it gives you some information about the tool, gives the credits to the research, and gives some information about the National High School Center as well. If you hit the yellow button, navigation is done through looking and hitting most of the yellow buttons throughout. You'll see that as I move my cursor over those buttons, you're able to hit them. So just to give you an overview, this is the main menu of the Early Warning System High School tool. And there are 3 columns, essentially. The tool setup is this one that's on the far left. Then the data inputs is in this middle column. And then outputs and reports is on the right. You can, I'm going to walk through these just pretty quickly before we get to the reports so that you have some context of the data that would be in the reports. Within the school information, it's pretty accurately titled what goes into this page. You would put in your school ID, school name, district name, information, general information. And the reason that we have options for putting this in is that we also have the capabilities of uploading your school or district logo. And so then when you run reports, the logo would appear along with some other information so that you can share these in appropriate venues based on the data that you're sharing. Also have information right here for your EWS team contacts as well. So you would identify who's going to go in the team, be clear on their roles and responsibilities, and then the phone and email. So the tool settings is the next one. And so anything that's surrounded in red is what you'll have to make sure that you customize to your local setting. So you'll see that there's a drop-down button right here for the grading periods. The tool has the capability of running the information either on a quarter, a 4-quarter system, a trimester, or a semester. And then you'll need to make sure that you have the correct days, the number of days, and the start of the period and the end of the period. And when we provided assistance to people who are experiencing challenges with the tool, oftentimes it might be that these start and end period dates, start dates and end dates of the quarters or the semesters or trimesters are slightly off, and that will it's worth taking the time to triple check that that information is correct when you're loading and putting the information into the tool. Also then provide what your grade point average scale is, and well as the number of credits necessary for graduating. The lower left area, in this area right here that I'm moving my cursor over, allows you to put specific student characteristics that you would like to have and on here. And the more information that you put in this area, this helps you then run reports with this information as a way of disaggregating some of your information. So you can choose what type of disabilities. If you want all 13 disability statuses in there, you can leave those in. Race and ethnicity, you'll put what's based on your school or district. And then your English language status as well. Some schools are doing this as the different kind of phases of English language learner status, or it could just be yes, no. That depends, again, on your local context. And disadvantaged status as well, however you want to identify that. The data that I'm showing you today is sample data. It's all fictitious as well. And so over here is the initial attendance time period, either a 20 or 30-day count. And then you have the different indicators. Now these indicators, the default settings is this column right here, and that's all based off of what Mindy went through with the research for the tool. If you wanted to change those default settings and overwrite them with a customized setting that you've done, say you've had multiple years of data and you're realizing that a 10% attendance rate for identification isn't quite right for your context, you can change that to maybe, let's say, 9%, and then it will override the default and just do the custom. And all you have to do is write in this box and hit enter, and it's going to then go off of the customized thresholds. I'm going to delete that. The behavior is on the customized area because that's something that has to be determined at the local level. And so that's something that your team or your district will need to determine what behavior then indicates being identified as at risk. So you can do it per grading period as well as an annual as well. You also have the opportunity, if you want to establish cohorts in the tool, you can also set up cohorts, so you could look enter those right in here. This is the intervention page when I was talking about the capability that the tool has of cataloging up to 30 interventions. These are some sample interventions that we've already inputted into the tool. You will then, with the drop-down menu, select if it's an attendance, behavior, or academic intervention, and then as well if it's a tier 1, 2, or 3. And then if you wanted to include a description, you can. That's really up to the team in terms of determining if they want that information. So that's what goes into those 3 steps. Those are the tool setup. Then with the data input, there are a few ways that you can input data into the tool. The National High School Center, and I know Mindy has already put up the URL for the National High School Center and where you can get information, additional information on early warning system work. We have also created what's called a collator tool that can help simplify the process of getting the student information data as well as student performance data into the tool. I'm not going to talk about that today. We do have a series of archived webinars that go, one of them is primarily focused on the collator tools. So if you want more information, you can go to our archived webinars and get more information there. We have put in some sample data. This is what it looks like as sample data is entered into the tool. There are ways of importing the data as well, so you can import as well as export data into and out of the tool. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about that. If you have additional questions, there's more resources for information. I do want to highlight, though, that throughout most of the pages within this tool, there is a blue More Information page where you can click and you'll see that a lot of information comes up that's specifically relevant to the page that you're on within the tool. And then you just click the More Information to have that pop-up box disappear. So then this is the student incoming risk status. The tool has the capabilities of having a flag for incoming at-risk status. Again, this will be a flag that is determined locally whether or not someone's at risk. Again, we've got more information elsewhere. I don't want to spend too much time on that today. I really do want to spend a fair amount of time talking, showing a few of the different reports. You can import this data. Again, we do have information on our website that can help you set up the import, a sample file in terms of how to save the data in the appropriate setting, and then can walk you through the process of importing that information as well. And then the final section of student performance, the data inputting, is the student performance. Again, we do have a collator tool that specifically addresses and helps you collect data from different areas to get information into the tool. And I'm going to then move on to the next section. So we've got our data in the tool already. Now we're going to look at our outputs in some of our reports. So this is just the student at risk page within the tool. Just to help orient yourself to it, you can filter. You'll see these filter boxes here. You can have all students. You can filter by all, disabilities, English language status, and disadvantaged. So you can filter by that. If you've established and are using cohorts, you can then filter also by cohorts. We set up 3. You can also then filter on different time frames. So this school is set up on quarters, and then you can also do the year totals. If a school is a semester school, sometimes we encourage them to also put their data in as a quarter rather than semester, so that they have more opportunities to input data and then be able to run some of the reports as well. So just a really, really quick overview of what you're seeing here. So as I scroll down, you'll see if a student has red behind them or around them or at any point in these columns over here, that indicates that a student is flagged for being at risk. And if you go to the top of the column, you'll see what the flag is. So the flag for attendance, quarter 3, you'll see on the screen right now 3 students were flagged with the red yeses. So those students are flagged for being at risk for the attendance flag. If we go one column to our left, we're now in quarter 2. And our indicators of at-risk are right up here. This column is a flag for behavior. And again, the behavior flag and what indicates if a student is going to get flagged is specific to the local context. So any of these red mean that a student has been flagged for being at risk. If we scroll down, we get to a gray area. That means the student's enrollment has changed and they're no longer enrolled in the school. And then the next, we're going to look at, so there's a few different ways in terms of navigating within the tool. You can hit these arrows, the before, back arrows. You can also then go to the main menus and say, okay, we were at the student at-risk status. We're going to assign students to interventions. So at this point, you can assign different students to interventions. And so I do know some of the student ID numbers because we've been working with this data for a while. So I'm just going to enter in one of the student ID numbers because that's how a lot of this information can be brought over. And a student will appear, and some of the information will then get filled out. And so we've got the name of our student, if there's a disability, if there's disadvantaged status, English language status, if they're assigned to a cohort, what interventions, the number of interventions that the student has been assigned. And then you'll also see some of these flags that you can see. So this student was flagged, this yes right here is for the incoming indicator, then attendance for both quarter 1 and quarter 2, and then behavior in quarter 2. And as we scroll down, we'll get a little bit more information. We can also at this point, so the student is already assigned to 3, we can assign students to an intervention as well. If we hit assign student to intervention, we'll then input information and then can move forward as well with assigning. There's another way that you can assign students to interventions as well. If you're at the student at risk, you can right-click and you'll see on assign interventions shows up, and you can then hit that way and you'll be brought to the same page within the tool for that student so that you can assign interventions. So there's a lot of information that you can do and how you can use this tool. Again, this is a free Excel-based tool. If you are using a Mac, you can try using the tool. Oftentimes, Macintosh computers do not allow macros, and so this tool runs on macros. So if you are using a Macintosh and you experience some challenges, it could be it's because you're using a Mac. We do recommend that you use a PC when you are using this tool. So I do want to spend a few minutes looking at the reports panel page and looking at some of the sample reports that are here. So the reports page, this panel page, you'll see that there are a number of types of reports. So there's a school level section for reports. There's a student level section of reports. Then there's a detailed student report. And then I'm clicking on the student level intervention summary report. I want to start back up at the school level reports. If you hit this drop down, you'll see that there is a number of different types of reports. Now, if you were able to open up that Word document, 2-page document that had the different types of reports, you'll have a summary of, each of the reports and the purpose and the information, 2-sentence summary of what those reports will do. I want to start with just the risk report summary, and I could select different cohorts, but I'm going to leave it at all, and I'm going to create the report. So you'll see that I can also change the time frame of the quarter after I've run the report if I'd like to, if I want to filter it somehow. It will get me it will share with me the number of students who dropped out, as well as if there were students that transferred out, our start period and our end period. So again, this is just the risk summary. It will tell us that. Now, if I change it to quarter 2, I'll have more information. So I have some more information at the quarter 2 spot. And that's mostly because this is sample data and we haven't been able to really fill it out comprehensively as we might if it was an actual school. So you'll be able to then, as we scroll down, you'll see the number of students who were not flagged for a quarter 2 attendance was 69, but 27 were flagged for attendance in quarter 2. And so it gives you the breakdown of the number of students who were not flagged as well as those who were flagged based on the quarter as well. So this is for all of our students. If we go back to the reports page and we want to look at our risk indicator summary report, we can also choose different categories, either a disability category, or disadvantaged, or English language learners. The report looks almost the same, but it will give us just specific students who are identified within those different characteristics in those groups. You'll see this is what it looks like for our quarter 2 English language learners. And when you print this, if you've uploaded your logo, the logo will also appear as well. So those reports at different levels, we've had feedback from principals and superintendents saying that they print out some of these school level reports for board meetings since specific students aren't identified on them. And other staff have told us that for specific meetings with students and parents, they'll print out student-level reports with the logos on them as well to help drive some of those conversations and show some of the data. The next report that I just briefly want to highlight is the Intervention Summary Report by Program. And so we're going to run that report. And at this point, there's a drop-down button right here. So you can then select which different program you want the data to, or the report to be run off of. And so for each program, the report's going to provide the number of the students who were assigned to that intervention throughout the school. And then the data is also then, if we go down, you'll see that our data is then, again, everything comes back to these indicators of risk status. And so it's our incoming risk indicator, it's attendance flag for the first 20 days, it's attendance flag for quarter 1, for course failures, for GPA flag, and then quarter 1 behavior. And again, this doesn't have a comprehensive amount of information because it's sample data. And again, you could then select all students, or you can also break this down by different groups of students as well. So again, that's a great way of just getting some additional information of how students that are assigned to different interventions or assigned to cohorts. If you do select different cohorts as well, you can get additional information that can help you kind of see how your groups of students are doing and how information is getting shared. So this intervention summary report, you can do it by program type, which is what I showed you. If you're using a tiered approach, you can also get this data by tiers. So you could separate out tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 for your different information. It can be separated out by the tiers. And you can also get it by type. So attendance. So remember, when you input those interventions, you determine if it's an attendance intervention, a behavior, or academic. So you can also get it by type as well. I want to just briefly show you the tiers, as I think that if you are using a tiered support, I think that that's a great way of looking at some of this information. So we don't have any information on our tier 1 here, but we do have information for our tier 2 and our tier 3. And these boxes right here, again, this is really almost the exact same of what's on your report page in front of you that you were able to print out from the presentation. That gives you the summary of what these different reports do provide. And one other at the school level that I want to highlight is this, the incoming indicator. And I know Mindy's answering questions that are coming in. I appreciate that, since I don't have my chat box open at this point in time to see what some of those questions are. So this is the incoming indicator of risk transition. So if you have identified what those incoming indicator of risk are, this will give you some of that information of how students, if they were flagged. And then you'll also see for quarter 1, that's how this report is set up to run right now. You can then see for which flag as well. And they give nice summary boxes over here with that information as well. So those are just some of the samples of the school level reports. Then there are a number of student level reports as well. And I'm just going to show and highlight a few of those as well so that you can see them. So this drop-down menu, there are a number, as you can see, of various types of reports. And each of us that have used this tool have some of our favorites I want to change the quarter to go to quarter 2. So I'm going to do a flag student report for the time frame of quarter 2, and I'll run that report, and this is what we get. You can also, if you wanted to, you can look at different interventions, but then you also can see, again, some of the summary information of how many students were flagged, the percent of students that were flagged. If you're doing and running the report based off of a cohort, it will tell you what that cohort is. And that way, if you print this report off later on and you don't remember all the different ways that you've set this report to be generated, that information is right there on the report for you. So it'll give you the student ID and the student's first and last name, and then if they were flagged. So it's a nice summary, and you can also then see their enrollment status. Again, if it's dark gray, then they are no longer enrolled. You can also, let me go back. This flag student report, you'll see that there are similar reports where you can run it, again, by disability, disadvantage, and English language learner status as well. If you have set an incoming indicator of risk, you can run some reports based off of this with information as well. And this is great too if we do know that there have been some states where the state determines what the incoming indicator of risk is. So it's a statewide formula that they use of combining data from multiple sources to identify what those students are who are at risk. In other places it can be as varied as a specific school, determining what that indicator of risk would be based off of the prior year assessment data, state assessment data, or it could be that a district sets what the incoming indicator of risk would be, so it's consistent district-wide. That can be particularly useful in cases where there's a lot of student mobility within the district as well. So that's what the student level report, the incoming indicator of risk report looks like. Then we also have 2 reports, and I'm going to first show you the off to on track. So this will give us the students who were off track but now are on track, and we can do that for the full year. And this is what this report looks like. Again, you've got the information describing the report on top, and then all the students will be listed in their separate rows. And then we can move the columns over to see by quarter what the breakout is in terms of if they were, what flagged they had. So these were students who were off track who are now on track. This goes to that graph that Minnie was showing in her series of slides of students who were 8th graders who were off track, were on track in the percentage of them when they were in high school graduated based on being off or on track. We also have a report that can be generated for students who were on track who are now off track. So you can also look for students, and that will be the students that are listed here. So we had a larger number of students who were on track who are now off track, as you can see appear on this report as we generate this report. Again, there are additional student reports, student level reports. You can get an undercredited student report, a student dropout report, and then if you want to create some customized reports, you can do that as well within the tool. If you are going to look at a detailed student report, again, you would just enter in the student ID over here, and the information then gets populated. And as we scroll down, you'll see what interventions the student was assigned, and in terms of what areas by quarter she was flagged for. You'll see that with the yeses up here as well. So that is a brief overview of the tool and highlighting some of the reports that the tool can create as well. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to the PowerPoint just to, I know we have about 10 minutes, so I wanted to see if we had any additional questions that Mindy might not have been able to answer or hadn't gotten to yet in the presentation. So while you're thinking of questions, I know Mindy has answered several of those throughout the presentation. I appreciate that. I'm also going to pass this back. Some training. So Mario asked a question, and knowing how much training is required to get the users to be able to use the tool. And that really depends on the school and the team formation. If there's an existing team where they've been doing a lot of data, looking at data, looking at how students are doing, if there's already a kind of tiered support in place, in those situations, it's generally less training is necessary. There's usually an overview to the tool and then some time to come back and work with that early warning system team, that team to make sure that answer any questions that they have as they've done different grading periods when they get that data back to help kind of sit in and help them listen to them and their questions of how they're using the data and help move that on. But since it's generally, the data is readily available data, so it generally doesn't, it takes some training, obviously, but the more training that people can get with additional coaching supporting it along the way, the more savvy some users have become. We've worked with, and we know of some schools where the users are incredibly savvy, having used the tool for multiple years. They've been able to look at their own trends and really customize some of those thresholds of when students are getting identified as being at risk, since they do have multiple years of data. I'm going to pass this back to Sandra to talk about the evaluation a little bit. I'm glad that people are finding this presentation to be very useful. So Sandra, I'm going to pass this back to you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks to all the participants that have stayed with us for the session. Also to Mindy for her part on this presentation. I think they did a great job in condensing a lot of information into a 2-hour session. There is more to talk about, and I hope that in particular with the stakeholders in Puerto Rico, we will be able to have those discussions during next year. I want to thank Peter Orn and the REL-NEI staff for their support in developing this webinar and in providing the technical assistance needed for us to be able to be with you today. And I want to thank you all for these great questions and your active participation in the webinar. We want to get your feedback, so please don't leave without taking this survey and giving us responses and recommendations on how to improve the work. And thanks, and happy holidays to all.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and this concludes this bridge event from the REL Northeastern Islands. All the registrants on this event will get an email in about 3 or 4 days with a link to the archive, and you can always go back to the Puerto Rico Alliance landing page on the REL-NEI website for further updates on the progress of the Research Alliance itself. Thanks very much, and have a great day.